Two men skillfully drag the condemned man onto the plank. After a few moments, the condemned man is secured and the executioner activates the mechanism of the guillotine. The headless body falls into a specially prepared box. Today, anyone can find this footage on the internet, although it should not have been there. No one gave permission to film the last public execution in the history of France. In fact, it became the last because of the many irregularities that took place during it, and because French citizens were not on their best behavior. The man whose last seconds of life were captured by the camera left a dark memory. Eugene Weidmann is considered one of the most brutal criminals to have operated in France in the 20th century. He was born on the 5th of February 1908 in Frankfurt am Main. His real name was Eugen. Weidmann's father was a successful businessman. The family did not need anything. However, from an early age, Eugene began to frighten his loved ones with tantrums and a tendency to steal. During the First World War, Eugene lived with his grandparents. Elderly relatives had no influence on the child, who became increasingly self-confident about his life of crime. His first encounter with Paris had nothing to do with romance. Weidmann fled to France to avoid being drafted into the army. He then moved to Canada. There, Eugen committed a robbery, was arrested and sentenced to a year in prison. He was then deported to Germany. Weidmann continued to commit burglaries and robberies and soon found himself in prison in his home country. The sentence was more severe, 5 years in prison, but Eugen wasted no time. In prison, he met and befriended inmates Roger Million and Jean Blanc, who later became his accomplices. While still in prison, Weidmann proposed a plan to Million and Blanc to move to France after their release and earn money by robbing wealthy foreign tourists. For their operations, the criminals rented a villa in the Paris suburb of Saint-Cloud. The intention was to lure victims there, but their first attempt failed. A desperate tourist managed to fight off 3 attackers and escape. After this failure, Weidmann did not abandon his plans, but became even more determined. On the 21st of July, 1937, at the Paris Exposition, Weidmann met 22-year-old girl dancer Jeanne de Cauvin, who had come to France to visit relatives. Weidmann knew how to make an impression and completely charmed the girl. The rendezvous at the villa in Saint-Cloud took place on the 23rd of July. Jean had no suspicions, had a good time, and enjoyed the company of Siegfried. Weidmann treated her with milk laced with a drug. When the girl began to faint, the killer strangled her. The loot was $430 and 300 francs in traveler's checks. After his arrest, Weidmann confessed that Jeanne de Cauvin was the only person whose death he regretted. She was very sweet and had no idea until the last moment. When I reached for her throat, she collapsed like a doll. The body of the murdered woman was buried in the basement of the villa, but the criminals had got a taste for it. Contrary to their initial plans, their victims were not all rich foreigners. On the 1st of September 1937, Eugene Weidmann hired a chauffeur, Joseph Coffey, for a trip to the French Riviera. In a forest near Tours, the assassin asked the driver to stop the car. The unsuspecting Coffey got out with Weidmann and was shot in the back of the head. The bandits made off with the car and 2,500 francs. On the 22nd of November 1937, Eugene robbed and killed his former prison mate, Fritz Frommer. Overconfidence was the reason for the bandits' fatal mistake. His business card was left in office. On the 8th of December 1937, police officers showed up at Weidmann's door to ask him a few questions. At the time, however, he was treated only as a witness. The gang leader, unaware of this, opened fire on the officers. The policemen were unarmed, but they did not hesitate to disarm him with a hammer that was lying on the landing. Weidmann was followed by his accomplices, who immediately began to confess. The ringleader then surrendered. The trial of Weidmann's gang began in March 1939. It became the most famous case in France since the trial of the madman Henri Landrieu, nicknamed Bluebeard. No one, including Weidmann himself, doubted what the verdict would be. The only question was what would happen to his main accomplice, Roger Million. On the 31st of March 1939, a court in Versailles sentenced Eugene Weidmann and Roger Million to death. Jean Blanc, who played a minor role in the gang, was sentenced to 20 months imprisonment. On the 16th of June 1939, French President Albert Lebrun commuted Roger Million's death sentence to life imprisonment. Eugene Weidmann was to face the guillotine. The execution was scheduled for the 17th of June and was publicly announced. This caused an unprecedented stir. Those who wanted to see the execution began to gather the night before. Usually the guillotine was used in the early hours of the morning, but this time it was delayed until it was quite light. It is thought that the executioner, Jules-Henri Desfourneaux, had a hand in the delay. It is quite possible that he arranged it with the same anonymous cameraman who filmed the guillotine. The cameraman needed good daylight, and Desfourneaux provided it. The National Guard had to clear the square of spectators by force so that the guillotine could be erected. And then the crowd could hardly be contained. Several people were injured in the stampede. Eugene Weidmann himself put on quite a show. He was hysterical and begged God to take pity on him and absolve him of all his sins. Finally, the executioner's assistants took him to the guillotine, and in a few seconds the criminal's decapitated body fell into the box. But that was not all. The soldiers of the National Guard, deciding that the worst was over, relaxed, and the crowd made its way to the guillotine. People wanted Weidmann's blood. They soaked their handkerchiefs in it and turned them into souvenirs. Among those who raged that day at the execution site was 17-year-old Christopher Lee, the future famous English actor who played the roles of Dracula, Grigory, Rasputin, and Saruman. When President Lebrun was informed of the conditions under which Weidmann was executed, he banned public executions by guillotine. Thus, the ruthless German killer became the first and last person in France to be guillotined on film. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe to the channel.